I certainly have some expertise at placing a different priority on your own individual moral judgment. You know, I spent close to 2 years in federal prison, 12 months in maximum security, 4 months in isolation cells, because I didn't want to be the kind of person that sat back and sent other people to Southeast Asia to do my killing for me. There was a law that said I was supposed to carry a draft card, and I refused to carry it. And I didn't do that because somebody told me to do it. I did that because of who I wanted to be. And my understanding that whether if I had 100,000 people with me, or if I was all by myself, what was at stake was who I was, and the rest would follow accordingly. And I think those are still remain to be the stakes. I mean, there's my whole experience as a political organizer, which is pretty extreme and extensive, has led down to one rule about social behavior, which is you get what you do. Nobody gets what they talk about. Everybody gets their behavior. And if you behave a way, you can call it whatever name you want, it is still that behavior. And certainly nothing is more true that way than torture. We can pretend that, it's something besides what it is, but one exposure to the kind of pain that we're inflicting, and suddenly that logic falls apart. And I think independent of politicians, independent of states, there is a fundamental allegiance we all must have to each other, which is why some behaviors are permitted and some behaviors are not. And that fundamental allegiance is all we've got and is becoming one of our most essential resources. And unless we can develop this, it's not clear that we can even survive as a race. I mean, a human race. While all this is going on in this idiocy in Iraq, we are facing the end of the planet. I mean, by the end of this century, half of this city is going to be underwater. Suddenly we're faced with the prospect of human civilization as we know it evaporating before our very eyes. And each day in each scientific study it gets closer and closer. And if we're ever to stand a chance of reversing that, it's because we as a human race have allegiance with each other, and we need to assert that. So that's my bit.
Thank you, David. When we talked earlier, we talked about how bullies get their comeuppance, and I think that's in part what we're talking about here. It comes around, goes around, comes back. Comments from the audience or from the panel?
I want to thank you for your comments. We were at Stanford when you were there doing all your good work. Also, I just want to mention, I really think we're all responsible, especially as psychologists, and I think we've done nothing about it as a profession, and CPA should be having forums. We should, through public service, I do the public service campaign for our chapter, I do the resilience campaign and the mind-body. We should be doing, not using psychological principles to scare people to accept the lies that have been perpetrated. And I think we have such a tremendous responsibility, just as average citizens, but especially as mental health professionals. And I think it's time we talk about it, and we get it out in the open, and we don't just keep it intellectualized, but we take it to the people, and we have town hall meetings, and we really take a stance and really show that we can make a difference. And we're all culpable for what's going on in Iraq and the lying that went on, the deception. We know this was planned before 9/11. For those of us who responded at 9/11 to help with mental health with Red Cross, I know a lot of the relatives there would not want this war to be going on and their names and the people they lost there. And obviously they're very passionate about it. And I really think it's time we don't let what happened in Vietnam continue to happen in Iraq. And we're responsible for the Iraqis who are dying as well. And thank you for bringing the attention that we should have to this.
Well, it strikes me you guys are in a great position to be able to stand up and say, politics aside, Mr. President, this is sickness.
Not to exonerate us as mental health professionals, but I think that other professionals also have to stand up. For example, the lawyers in this country. There's a fellow over here at Berkeley, John Yoo, that states the president in time of war need not follow Geneva Conventions. He need not be restricted by Congress in ordering torture. So where are the lawyers that we're going to stand up against John Yoo? So, next.
I grew up in Israel, I tell you, and I left Israel for more reasons, because I think the pure existence in the country was a way to collude with what happened in the West Bank. And I served in the Israeli army as a lieutenant in the paratroopers, and I left for this reason. The same question asking myself around what happened in Iraq right now, and I feel that driving like 6-cylinder car here, and the way I heat my house, and the way I consume, I am part of the problem. It's so easy for us just to point the finger, but aren't we all also responsible for the way we drive, the way we heat our houses, the way we consume, as the reason why we need the oil, and many other reasons that lead us to wars all around the world? So I'm looking at my own collusion, and I'm not sure where I'm going to go next. If I feel a colluder here, it's perhaps South Africa. But and I seriously think about it. But I think we are all colluders, and it's easy to point the finger at Bush or anybody else.
I couldn't agree more.
I'm a psychologist here in Concord and the East Bay. I think what you said, the behavior, no matter what you call or what you name that behavior, is a behavior. And as my passionate colleague and friend said here, that we all need to be active and be part of the process, which is a decision-making process. And as psychologist, I'm speaking because I got this guts from my grandfather. He was a very simple man, and he could fight the President of India through his arguments. And they would listen to him. So those things, we need to get involved in the local politics, in the decision-making bodies. I'm trying to do, I got on the commission, on the Human Relations Commission in the city of Concord. And in the leadership training, I saw that 52% of the city budget is being allocated only to one department. And all of you know that department. It's not only in the city, in the county, in the nation, at the international level. So we do need to make sacrifices. And the word sacrifices in this country, nobody talks about it. Only we listen that people, those who commit suicide to kill other people, they are the people, those who are sacrificial lambs. So we do need to take initiative, and we do need to participate at a very local level so that we could really make the difference within the community we live. If we don't do that, if we don't model that behavior, people, those who are getting services from us, they don't have the guts, they don't have the cooking resources, they are so paralyzed by the fear we are creating in the media and our politicians, pretending to be truth seekers on the screens, pretending to speak the truth for the global goodwill and global health. And I think we need to really expose and do our little part, what we could do. So those are my comments.
I think it's important, you know, my whole experience with politics, you know, everybody has the question of what can I do? And I think it's important for us to remember, which I'm sure you all know by training, if nothing else, that for every person who acts or who walks around, there are 10 people watching him trying to figure out what to do. And one of the things that makes taking acts or raising your voice so important is because it enables so many other people, you know, none of whom may not have any more power than you've got, But collectively, suddenly that power begins to shift when we begin to talk to each other and share that kind of bond. In my experience in the draft resistance movement, where we were going around, asking people to put themselves at risk for anywhere up to 5 years of their lives in federal prison, one of the most important factors was finding the first person. When that person did it, and they did it and felt better for them for having done it and didn't fall through the surface of the earth and swallowed by the great miasma or whatever, but instead seemed to be functioning better as persons than they had before they took the act, suddenly that made it available. And we're at the stage where we're trying to make something other than the status quo available to our fellow Americans. And for all the feelings of powerlessness, I think it is important to remember that we've done a pretty good job. In 2003, when they started this war, there were 20% of us against it. Now, by latest polls, we're talking 60% against it. That's an extraordinary change to have happened in 3 years. It certainly didn't go that quick in the Vietnam era, I can tell you that much. And, right off, before the war even started, we had 250,000 people walking down Market Street against it here. So, that while I think we're all frustrated and all feeling powerlessness and all experiencing the apathy around this, it's also important to remember that we haven't just rolled over and that has had a significant impact.
We have time for one more brief comment, and if you have other comments, please, we have some time at the end also, so keep them for that.
I want to just sound a less optimistic note. It seems to me that you're trying to carve out a piece of behavior that seems to me to be pandemic. If you think about our heroes, Cool Hand Luke or John Wayne or anything, the hero is the person who takes revenge, who has not tamed the Talionic impulse. And it seems to me, even, I marched, I was one of those 250,000 at the beginning of the war. I was with you in the 60s. But the rest of the country, we live in a very rarefied atmosphere here, and the rest of the country, even when you say that the 60% now are against the war, they're not against the war because they think it's wrong and terrible. They're against the war because we're losing. And we don't like losers. We don't side with losers. We like winners. And as long as, if we were winning, they'd be with the war. And it seems to me to think that we have to change the whole society, not just about the war, but about who our heroes are, who we respect, who we, what our icons are, and that those at every level of society, kids, adults, movies, music, everything is about violence and taking revenge, getting back, winning. And I'm just very, very pessimistic about it.
Well, I certainly don't. I agree that the total picture is one that has plenty of work out for us out there. I'm not sure that I feel comfortable sitting here in this chair and deciding what the reasons were people brought to their change of heart about the war. I suspect there are probably as many reasons as there are reasoners out there, and that we may find encouragement in some of those reasons and discouragement in other of those reasons. But to me, it's all simply makes the case that without encounter between, if we are a special culture that is so different from the rest of it, that to expect the rest of us has any chance of changing without contact with us is absurd. I think we, that we need to make options for people in red states as well as blue states, and I think the answer, whether that will work or not, is not something we get to know. My experience of politics is it's like being inside a pinball machine. The thing usually bounces about 12 times before it lands, and you're never quite sure where it's going to land or how it's going to land or who it's going to land on. But it seems to work. I remember 1965 in the Vietnam era. If you wore hair over your ears, you were called a communist. Much less if you thought the war was wrong. And 10 years later, a huge American majority had decided that the war was not worth continuing. So something happened in that process. And while it wasn't clean and wasn't textbook, and probably many of the reasons people did stuff that they did was unacceptable to us in hindsight, it did happen. We're not still in Vietnam, and the reason we aren't was because there was a popular rebellion against it that was organized by people just like you and me, who didn't have any particular power except their own decision to stand up and be counted.
Okay, we need to move along. Daniel Ellsberg joined the Defense Department in 1964 as Special Assistant to Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton, working on Vietnam. At the RAND Corporation in 1967, he worked on the top-secret McNamara study of U.S. decision-making in Vietnam, 1945-1968, which later came to be known as the Pentagon Papers. In 1969, he photographed a 7,000-page study and gave it to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In 1971, he gave it to the New York Times, Washington Post, and 17 other newspapers. For many of us in the anti-war movement, he became a symbol of resistance to the Vietnam War and an example of courage and integrity that is still remarkable today. Take it away, Dan.
Thank you. Well, it's an honor to me to be with these panelists. I would not be here, I guess, or wouldn't have been asked to be here were it not for David Harris and people like David Harris, who revealed to me a way of being a patriotic American that had not occurred to me earlier, a way of being a citizen. There's a lot to be pessimistic about, though I'm struck by the last comment there. I have to correct you in one respect. Yes, John Wayne remains a hero to too many Americans. John Wayne recruited me into the Marine Corps, as he did about half the Marine Corps, with a sense of Iwo Jima, though he himself had dodged the draft. Really. But later my heroes became Rosa Parks. I found they changed gender and color. But Cool Hand Luke, I'm afraid you have, is a hero. Cool Hand Luke did no violence to anyone, did not take revenge on anyone. He was in prison because he was, in a drunken fit, was snipping off the tops of parking meters, you may remember. And in the whole movie, he never does any violence to anyone. He's a hero to the people around him in prison because he never gave in. They couldn't break him. And one other thing. By the way, he was, put in a kind of isolation cell, in the heat. He staggers out. He pretends to have been broken, but uses that only as a means of escaping. One other aspect, though, reminds me a little bit of David Harris and a lot of the others. Why is he called Cool Hand Luke? You probably don't remember, but since I know the movie by heart, essentially, he was a hero to me. At one point, he's in a poker game and wins the pot, and the big bullying guy who's insists on turning over his cards, which he hadn't shown, and he had nothing. He says, "That's nothing. You got a pair of deuces or something." And Luke says, "Sometimes nothing can be a mighty cool hand." Now, the truth is that David Harris did not, first, he wasn't only acting individually, if I can speak for him here, I think I know this much. He was not acting non-politically in what he did. As he said, he did lots of activism. He organized other people before he was indicted and after he was indicted and after he got out of prison. It was certainly right to refuse to go to Vietnam. But there were lots of ways of avoiding that, as our present president and all of his other people, except Powell, showed, actually. They all had other priorities. And none of them went to Vietnam, except to Powell. But David Harris went to prison. He didn't have to do that. And by doing so, I think he meant to have an effect, or hoped to have an effect. Though, as he said, no, I think it was Terry who was saying, he didn't calculate. It certainly wasn't because he believed he would stop the war by doing that. But he hoped it might help. It might be an example to some others, and he was right. He was effective. I heard that message from Randy Keeler, who was in Natuna with David, and from others, and it had an effect on my life. And the effect was to do what I could non-violently and truthfully, even if it didn't have much chance of affecting the war, and even at great personal cost, which I did expect to go to jail actually all my life, and I was charged for a possible 115 years. Now, many people inferred, in fact, people did psychological inferences on me without having ever met me, and assumed that I was under the belief that I would end the war with the Pentagon Papers. I won't go into it now, I'll just say that's false. Pentagon Papers ended in '68. I had no impression at any time that they were likely to have a big effect. It involved history, not Nixon's current events. If I'd had Nixon's current cables and so forth, I would have put those out and I wouldn't have bothered with history. I didn't think there was much chance. But my example was people like Randy Keeler and David Harris and others who were doing, and Joan Baez and others, who were doing all that they could, even at great personal risk, to have a chance of affecting the war. Now, a reason I'm especially glad to be in this panel and was eager to accept it was not just the honor of my fellow panelists, but to speak to you people in this room, because I believe that in the spirit of the general subject we're dealing with here, how groups can affect public opinion, the people in this room now, not all of them, some subset of the people in this room, do have an immediate chance to affect public opinion, not with any guarantee or any radical way, but in a helpful way at a grave crisis in our country. The crisis is not just that we've started to torture people, or that we've just started to tap people, by the way, or that we're fighting in a country where we have no business killing anyone. We've done all that before. The water torture was used extensively in the Philippine, quote, insurrection, which was put down very, very violently at the start of a century ago. For a century and more before that, slaves were tortured routinely, not by all Southerners. Most of them didn't have slaves, but the ones who did tortured them. And the Northerners mostly weren't affected by that. In Vietnam, we've tortured, I've said for years now, since I became somewhat enlightened about our history, after my trial, I was aware of something I was not aware of in Vietnam. The United States is a torture state, has been a torture state, though, and I wasn't thinking of the prisons, through proxies. I became increasingly aware that the United States tortures people in Indonesia, Vietnam, El Salvador, Guatemala, with U.S. advisors, U.S. funds, U.S. training manuals, U.S. people on the hand. We put people in to torture, and if they don't torture, we remove them and put other people in to torture for us in our client states or our neo-colonies, our effective colonies. There is a difference that David pointed to. Something is different now going on. Same CIA advisors, same CIA manuals, as by the way are detailed in this book, which I recommend to you very strongly, A Question of Torture by Al McCoy, which I haven't finished reading. I was looking at some of it right here, which makes very clear, in fact, that the torture going on in the world today is a peculiarly American form of torture, more effective and longer lasting than the more physical kinds of torture. It involves a number of aspects: sensory deprivation, no touch, stress positions which involve self-inflicted pain, a paradigm of torture, or a model, which was developed by American and Canadian psychologists in the 50s and 60s. D.O. Hebb, a number of others that he names in here, were critical to this development, mostly on CIA contracts. The difference is now, as David said, that we're doing it openly with the open support. Once the pictures came out, were leaked out, and it was leaked into public consciousness, the president and the vice president for torture, as they call him now, are openly putting this forth as necessary and therefore legitimate, and thus calling on all of us to be openly complicit. John McCain, with his bill against torture, says, when I was tortured in Vietnam, in North Vietnam, one of our major aspects of strength of all of us prisoners was we were different. We would not be doing this in their place. I recognized that immediately. I would have felt the same. I'm an American. I'm being tortured, and I certainly exposed myself to that a great deal driving in the countryside. Friends of mine were tortured, caught and tortured. on the same roads I drove. So I had to think about it, how I would behave, but I know I would have thought, we Americans don't do that. I was wrong, Americans did do that, I was mistaken. But they had done us the favor of keeping that covert for all these years and denying that we did it. Now it's very open. The experiment being run by the president is whether he can't win and effect a referendum. He's not up for election again, but in 2006 with Congress and with his successor, for all the methods he's using, essentially, including the NSA wiretaps, which were used in the 60s and elsewhere before, just like now, but now open. McCain got a bill, 97 people voted for it, 96 or 7, against torture, absolutely. Rejected all efforts to change the bill, to amend it, to allow loopholes in it. Signed by the president, but with a reservation on a theory developed by Alito and David Addington and John Yoo, professor of law at Berkeley, that by signing statements he could in effect nullify the legislation and say, I will obey this law to the extent I regard as appropriate. Just nullify it. Congress has so far done nothing to change that situation, so it's got a straight constitutional crisis not being recognized at this moment. The president is saying in that case and others, the case of torture and the case of the NSA wiretaps, as Dean said, he had in effect been the first president to admit to an impeachable offense, to a felony, openly, and said, I'm going to keep doing it, I will do it. So far, no investigation, let alone impeachment or indictment of this by the Congress. We're being asked then to link arms, in effect, and say this is okay and our form of government has changed. Now, when I say I'm talking to people here specifically, I'm referring to this. The American Psychiatric Association, I understand, has condemned the participation of any psychiatrists in participation in torture. And they have adopted the broad definition of torture, which definitely includes the psychological torture developed by American psychologists in the 60s and used ever since, members of the Psychological Association. They include that as the torture that is forbidden. Now, why is it necessary to mention a psychiatrist? Because Jeffrey Miller, the commandant of Guantanamo, who replaced, I read here, the previous commandant who had been criticized by the CIA and others for coddling prisoners by refusing to use these methods and by putting Korans in their cells. That guy was replaced by Miller, and one of his first moves was to introduce BSCT teams, BSCT, behavioral science consultation teams, which consisted of psychiatrists and psychologists and others, who would be given data from clinical inquiries, interviews of the patients in order to exploit their psychological vulnerabilities, and would use this to advise on torture techniques and to help apply these torture techniques, psychiatrists and psychologists. These same teams were then brought over to, from Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib and other prisons. Now, the Psychiatric Association has condemned this. The American Medical Association, here on page 183 of McCoy's book, cited these practices at Guantanamo as a clear ethical violation. They should diligently guard against exploiting information furnished by the patient to reveal confirmational information only with the authorization of patients and various other things. Condemn that. By contrast, quote, the American Psychological Association, APA, reflecting its long involvement in military research and CIA behavioral experiments, claimed that its members were not barred from, quote, national security endeavors. In fact, continue the quote, the APA's Code of Ethics has stricter, more specific standards for the treatment of laboratory animals than for human subjects, such as the Guantanamo detainees. They formed a special task force, now I'm paraphrasing, including on ethics, to look at ethics, including military psychologists, which said that psychologists should not engage, direct, support, facilitate, or something, torture or other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. But this conclusion, released in June 2005, failed to bar members from military interrogations outright, saying simply and vaguely that they should, quote, be mindful of factors unique to these roles that require special ethical consideration. They also refused to recommend that members be bound by international standards of human rights, neglected to specify their obligations to detainees, and even quoted recommended research to, quote, enhance the efficacy of psychological science to national security, including, quote, the effectiveness of military gathering techniques. How many people here knew what I've just told you? How many did not? Okay, some did not. Now you know, or don't take my word for it, look it up here or investigate, ask what the position is. Why is there a difference from the Psychiatric Association and the American Psychological Association? Well, McCoy gives two reasons. Emerging from World War II as the most militarized among the social or biological sciences, this is page 32, psychology already had a professional mindset that made it a natural CIA ally in the search for new interrogation techniques. And he goes on to the reliance on grants and the usefulness of national security and so forth. One other reason, more broadly, quote, the psychologists studied the human mind, gaining knowledge and power without being restrained, like psychiatrists, by the Hippocratic Oath, making them more flexible in their service for the state, its military, and clandestine agencies. At one point, apparently, someone raised a question whether the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm, do not use the information of the relationship with the patient to the detriment of the patient or the consultant, do no harm. Someone made an email query in 2005 about psychiatrists taking the Hippocratic Oath. Now, of course, researchers, presumably, of some kind, the people who do research on pigeons, let's say, probably could do without the Hippocratic Oath, but therapists and others. Question is raised. So Stephen Benke, JD, PhD, director of the Ethics Office, American Psychological Association, replied, quote, as far as I am aware, most psychologists do not take the Hippocratic Oath, although there is nothing that would preclude them from doing so. So there's a professional reason. As a matter of fact, he gives here, in stating why the AMA came out against this, that their guidelines, of course, are applications of broader ethical principles from the ancient Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, all the way to the Medical Association, World Medical ban on participation in torture or other forms of cruel and unhuman, the UN principles of medical ethics prohibiting any physician contact and so forth. So there are medical principles, there are UN principles, there are Geneva principles, and there is domestic law, which the president has simply said, I'm not going to obey, period. Which gives us, as American citizens, a little challenge right there. To suggest that you should not, if I were to suggest to you that you should not individually take part in this stuff, that would not be regarded as controversial, and nobody's going to force you to do it. But it doesn't take forcing. What Milgram showed, now, question, I'm sorry, this book. I'm sure in this audience, all of you have read one or more articles by Milgram or seen the video on his stuff or heard about it, right? How many have done that? Okay, all. Virtually everyone here. How many of you have, as it happens, read the whole book? You see 2, 3, 4 hands, 5. Is that right? How many have not read the whole book? Okay. I want to urge you to read the whole book. And this is why. You read one paper, and it's very easy to imagine that, well, these particular Americans acted like Germans or Japanese or Soviets. But surely there was something in the experiment that got that, and some small change or something might have gotten different. It's hard to avoid feeling that, because there's great resistance to believing Milgram's great finding here, which has now been replicated all over the world, that people all over the world do this. You don't have to be German, and you don't have to be American either, by the way. You don't have to be in great feeling of revenge. No question that revenge is a major factor, which I believe is the human character that's going to do us in, as likely as anything else. You don't have to even be in great fear, or fear of physical harm yourself. Milgram's experiments all over the world, no fear. They weren't in fear. In fact, it doesn't take much. I want to recommend to you a book, my guess is, I'll bet not one person here, maybe not more than one or two, have read. The Obedience Experiments by Arthur G. Miller. Now here's an elite audience here. How many have read this book? Anybody? Okay. I strongly recommend this because it goes beyond Milgram to show all the experiments that were done after Milgram's work, which did go beyond the variations that he described. But by the way, the reason for reading the whole book is that it shows you how many meticulous variations he really did do. And as you get a third of the way and half of the way and 3/4 of the way through this book, you think, oh my God, this is an extremely, quote, robust finding, very hard. In other words, it's just too easy to get anybody to do it. What Arthur G. Miller shows by summarizing other research is you don't have to have authority. Obedience is not the only way you get it. Obedience being another way we're going to come to grief in the nuclear age. Conformity will do it. You don't have to have a hierarchical authority. Experiments were done with essentially peer examples, like Ash's experiment. Above all, promise. I promised. I don't break my promises. I said I would follow this protocol, so I have to do it, and so forth. It's short. It's easy to get anybody, humans, men or women. It's done with women. It's easy to get them to torture for lots of reasons. To stop it is what's hard in stress situations. I'm going to put to you now, in the last couple of minutes here, something that you could do in this group that is not totally easy or without risk. It is not without risk to criticize your own organization, your own team, your own bosses. In fact, that's what keeps people in line for disastrous processes like Iraq. This particular war, I think, is even more than Vietnam. The government is filled with people who knew beforehand it would be a disaster in just the way that it is. It is also filled with people who know that we're about to attack Iran within the next months or a year or two, with even more disastrous effects, who believe that it's a disaster, who have not given us documents to show that because it would lose their clearance, they would lose their career, they would lose their livelihood. If they were found, leaking actually is much less risky than that, but if they leaked in a way that they would be found, if they put their heads up and their names were known, their children's college education would be risked, their marriages would be risked, a lot would be at risk. I conclude, it's at nearly 75 next month, what I've learned is that men in power will do virtually anything, kill any number of people, torture any number of people, any nationality, to keep their job, to keep their power, to keep in office, to keep from a setback, and the people under them will go along with virtually anything. And when I say anything, I'm not limiting that to torture, I mean nuclear war. And nuclear war is anything. It's hundreds of millions dead. They'll go along with that rather than risk the goodwill of their team members. The American Psychological Association, as I understand it, has distinguished itself from the Psychiatric Association, the American Medical Association. I'm not talking to doctors or psychiatrists, I'm talking to psychologists here, and some psychiatrists, of course. Some of you are also in the psychiatric business. But the psychologists are members of an association that has clearly distinguished itself and has refrained from condemning either the practice of torture or the participation of psychologists, licensed psychologists and members of this association in the torture. Now that is not without effect. When the president says this is something we have to do, It's necessary for our security, and therefore we must do it, and therefore it's legitimate. Is it helpful or hurtful to his cause to have, well, let's go at the other end, the American Medical Association condemning it? No, it hurts him. It goes against the legitimation of that he's seeking. But the Psychological Association has weighed in. They haven't been neutral. They've in effect said, yeah, we agree, we've always been part of this, and we're going to continue to be part of it. I think that's disgusting. But that's just me. That's just me. You discover your group identity and feelings of shame and various things. I'm not a member of this group. I can say I realize how much of a Marine I remain. My roots when I'm ashamed of what the Marines did in Fallujah, disgusted by it, that Marines did that. And as a Jew, I was disgusted by the Jewish legitimation of torture, which was the only country in the world that openly legitimated torture, until the Supreme Court finally condemned it. What I'm not clear on is whether that had any effect on what they did, but at least they condemned it. I think the lawyers should be ashamed of themselves, and I said this at Bolt Hall in a vigil a month ago, ashamed that John Yoo is teaching there without any challenge. I'm not saying he should be fired from his tenure. I'm saying he should be challenged and criticized with his absurd political, legal rationale of all of these things. The torture, the detention, the retention, everything else. There's no move, however, to do that. You have the opportunity in your lives now to use your position as members of this association to make your voice heard, that your association, not just your personal position, should weigh in against the president's policy and against the participation. You can't stop it. There will always be psychologists, and you don't have to be a psychologist either, but there will be psychologists who will participate in this, and psychiatrists and others. That won't stop. They'll have enough. But they don't have to do it with the feeling that they're doing something applauded by their association and legitimation. And that'll cut down the number who do it, and it will cut down the willingness of others to participate altogether. So whereas you all have this petition here about condemning the practice, which you cannot sign, I suggest to you that some of you might wish to add a sentence to that in your own writing. This says what you personally condemn as doctors, nurses, psychologists. I'm speaking only for myself here now, not for Bill Roller or anybody else. I suggest that you have the opportunity to write on that. I believe the American Psychological, well, first the California Psychological Association and the American Psychological Association should condemn the participation by psychologists in any form of torture under any conditions. Now, you're signing that, or Cal signing it, will not guarantee, it won't even make likely, the ending of torture. But it'll have a useful effect. California does it, it'll have a useful effect for sure on the American Psychological Association. I understand the California Association is the largest part of the Psychological Association. I'm saying this is your opportunity right now in a crisis in which our country is one more 9/11 away from being a police state. So while we have the freedoms that we do have to speak out, I believe it's likely to get much harder to speak out. This is the time to show some courage. And as I say, it's an honor for me to be next here to David Harris, who showed a generation, his generation, that without taking revenge, without being violent, and without lying, you could show courage, you could speak by taking on yourself the punishment of your own society. Let them take the revenge. But you could speak out in a way and show what you as an individual man or woman could do to help stop that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for challenging us in that way, and I hope many of my colleagues follow through. Gilbert?
Well, I can't speak for the entire association, but I can say as the president of the California Psychological Association, I absolutely agree with the notion that we should condemn torture. Behind me is Evelyn Marchini, who's the chair of our social issues task force that I mentioned earlier. And this could be the first issue we have to deal with as an association. I also want to say that Stephen Benke, the director of the ethics office, is here. He's at our convention. He attended the torture workshop earlier today and had lunch with Dr. Jacobs. So I know he's been hearing about this. And I don't want to ruin his evening, but you know, you're all welcome to talk to him. I mean, and certainly you are welcome to also. I'll introduce you to him and speak with him directly.
Gil, I wonder if we could set up some way that some of us could have access to talk to him and any kind of way to express opinions and share thoughts about how we were being represented.
I can't speak for him, but
No,
I
but we
certainly
could try
can
something.
ask him. You know, I think it's possible to ask him. Let me just say one thing. Yeah, no, I was going to say that. Sharon Brem is also here, who's the president-elect of the American Psychological Association. She was also at the torture workshop this morning, and I spoke with her later this afternoon, and I'm not making any apologies for APA, but she was also troubled by the way the statements from APA came out and the way the media handled it. And, you know, again, I don't want to ruin her evening. The reception that follows this is supposed to be but, you know, you are all welcome to talk to them. So they're here, and I'm so proud that we were able to bring you here today to speak to psychologists. There are no psychologists, by the way, in front. I need to just mention that to you because it's unfortunate. But the speaker this morning, who from Survivors International, Jacobs, is indeed a psychologist. So I just want to personally thank you for coming here today and for delivering your message. Thank
Of course, I appreciate that, and I thank you, and I applaud your saying that. And I also was aware, and I appreciate your having introduced the panel and called it all together. I did want to make one distinction that I'm suggesting that what you said is that you would, in effect, if I understand you, sign this petition that you condemn torture, or that's your own position. You perhaps haven't read it, but read it. And I would infer from that that you would sign that and that many others would. I am suggesting...
I did read it, and I told Bill he could put my name on it.
Great, great. But I am suggesting personally, and I said I didn't discuss this in advance of this session with Bill, I said I wanted to say it, that the position that some of you add an extra piece of information on this. Not merely that you condemn torture, but that you call on the association to condemn the participation in torture. And as I understand it, it's not a question of removing licenses or banning people, or that you even have the capability to do that, as far as I know, or that you would want to do it, but that you condemn the participation of that is, after one can give reasons for not doing that. And the Psychological Association has explicitly rejected doing that. But I do point out, as I said, the American Medical Association and the Psychiatric Association have done just that. So whatever the reasons for not doing it, they have somehow surmounted it. And is it just this question of the Hippocratic Oath? I hope not. So that's.
I think it's important to know not to give these petitions to me or to Dan, but to give them to the association.
To Benke or
to Benke or whoever would be the
If you
person
talk to him, and
elected.
I'd love to talk to him, let him know, in other words, on that additional point, that there are psychologists who want their association to do this. And since the association has rejected doing it in the past, I don't have to tell you grown-ups here that you're doing that with your name face-to-face is not without professional risk. But I am saying this, and I don't tell anybody, you should take this risk. I don't know what your situation with your ailing mother is, and your spouse and your children and your profession and what other things you can do. I don't know that, but I can tell, what I do tell is consider taking this risk, because we're in a crisis here where every little bit can make a difference.
Okay, we have several people who want to make comments. We only have a few minutes, so please make them brief.
Let me just ask one thing, if you want. Leave your petitions here and I'll get them.
Gilbert will collect the
Very good, thank
petitions.
you, thank you. Yeah.
One thing that psychologists have a lot of experience with is putting together treatment plans.
Say it again.
Yeah, one thing that psychologists have a lot of experience with is putting together treatment plans. And what I'm hearing is it sounds like we need two kinds of treatment plans. The patient, the target patient for the first one are people like me. I've got 2 jobs, getting another master's degree, have community involvements, trying to keep a balanced life, et cetera, and everyone I know is in the same situation. And people hear about this stuff, we're bombarded in the media, we're aching to do something, and somehow it feels like, true or not, our life isn't set up in a way that we could do this kind of stuff, you know? So it seems like the first treatment program should be some kind of intervention so that people could do this stuff, you know? So that seems like number one. Number two is, I don't see the person right now, but the fellow who made the point about changing society. This is not a one aspect thing, it's multimodal, multi-level. So, I mean, that's the second treatment plan. We have to be what do you do and how do you do it. Everything I understand about what a lot of the right has been doing is this, they've had their plan for 20, 30 years. You know, ever since we failed in Vietnam, you know, how do we take over the media, how do we do this, how do we do that, and they've got a plan, and they're doing it. And I don't see anything or hear anything on our side that's comparable.
Could I ask you what your plan would be for changing the position of the American Psychological Association?
Well, that may be the first goal in the multi-whatever, you know.
For people here.
But those are the two treatment, my point is, I'm hearing the need for 2 treatment plans. And I'm saying those, I think, are what they are.
Okay, Vivian?
Yeah, I want to say that I came up from LA mainly because of this panel, because it was exciting for the first time after not being in San Francisco for a long time, although I lived here in the 70s. And I work now with Peter Levine, who does some things about the trauma vortex and about PTSD, and with the idea that and I know that we as a country have been in a trauma vortex, that the psychologists are in that trauma vortex of how to make a living. And he says that with every nervous system that's in a trauma vortex, there's a healing vortex. And it feels to me that by being present at this panel, if we move towards creating a healing vortex, with whatever plans we can do, then this is really very significant to be here, because we really need a healing vortex. That healing, the reason I think psychologists have been able to, I'm making more of a talk than a question, but we depersonalize even the field of psychology, we're calling it the prediction of control of other people's behavior, rather than making psychology a human thing where the ethical values would be really a part of it. And I think that we need to move away from this prediction and control paradigm to one in which we and our nervous systems are connected to that of the world. And I think that there are people in our field who are working in this, working with trauma victims, but we really have to work with trauma perpetrators to get them out of that excitement vortex and really moving and taking some step to do it, and not just blaming us as Americans, because it's the suicide bombers are just as guilty of getting into these trauma vortex things. We're all in this together. So I really want to thank you for being at that apex of that.
Okay, thank you. The last comment, Andy?
Thank you for your comments. I'm glad you brought up the idea of conformity as well as obedience. I agree with David on the revenge theme, but I was fortunate enough to work with Stan Milburn, not on that study, but shortly after, and kind of all of us who did were, really moved by that. And a number of my cohorts successfully stayed out of the Army by citing that study and saying that they could not serve because they couldn't go in with any assurance that they would be put under that kind of pressure and yield to it. My recollection...
Did that keep them out? I mean, it's a wonderful position.
I'm putting that out
Special
because I think a
knowledge.
similar kind of strategy could be used today, especially if people have went against who had the same kind of feeling inside of them and could use both APAs as evidence of the destructive nature of this in their resistance, I think that we could have a lot more success in getting more people to hear you and to move at it before they're in a stage, where Cindy Sheehan has to come out and fight for people getting killed, to say, hey, we don't want to be in that position. 73%, my memory might be slightly off, but of the people in this room would torture, would follow the obedience, would press that lever. We don't want to believe it's us, but it is us. So one of my cardinal core rules of running groups over these years has been when there's any person that's standing up against the conformity pressure that exists in any group, I make sure that that person gets heard and gets a fair hearing, and we resolve it so that they're not made into a event. And that's what we're talking about here. How do we keep our government from making the rest of the world into an event?
Well, thank you. And that is the last comment to me, I guess. But it occurs to me also from what the previous speaker was saying about working with trauma perpetrators. And actually, myself, the reason I was interested in Milgram was I've always been interested in the perpetrator to a large extent, having been associated with and been a perpetrator of bombing of North Vietnam, even when I opposed it. But my job called for me to be a facilitator and a perpetrator, and I did it. So I've been very interested in the Milgram experiment from that point of view. From that point of view, I have to point out the reason in this audience, and I'm talking about you and your association, is not that your social role on the whole and in general has been worse than others. As I said, the lawyers, talked about lawyers. My field of economics helped to take apart German and Japanese cities from their knowledge of economics. Fire insurance executives participated in how to create the firestorm in Tokyo and Hamburg, the greatest single act of terrorism ever. I'm not talking, as I say, to doctors and psychiatrists. I learned from the McCoy book what I didn't know otherwise, and I've just been reading it. When it comes to the specific question of torture, which is not the only evil in the world and not the only evil we're doing, but it's one specific thing, it turns out it comes out of the psychological association. Not every one of you by any means, but your associates. So when you talk about trauma perpetrators, look around. The trauma, not all psychologists were trauma perpetrators, but many of them were and are. And my assumption is that by your professional association with them, you're in a position to do something about that and about the position of the association, and that's something I encourage you to do. I'm so happy to hear the President's comments about what he's going to do, including being a courier for your own petitions here. So I do hope you'll sign up on those.
On that note, we do have to close our panel. I do want to thank Dan and David. I hope that at some further point we may be able to codify what we've been talking about here in some material way.
Getting better with
Please, those
age.
of you that want to do evaluations, please do so. You should do that. And also, if you have books that you want to sign, our panel members will sign them.
You should have been given this speech.